There is a divine paradox woven into human existence that few dare to examine closely. The truth whispered through ancient texts and modern revelation alike declares something extraordinary. Every human being is God in human form, conscious creative power clothed in flesh. Yet most walk through life on automatic, repeating patterns inherited from the past, reacting to circumstances as if they were victims rather than creators. How can divinity itself be asleep to its own nature? The answer lies in something Neville Goddard explained in his most profound works. When consciousness identifies with the body, the senses, and external conditions, it forgets its source. And in that forgetting, it creates automatically, unconsciously, perpetuating what already is. The pain of living on automatic is familiar to many souls. Days blend into weeks, weeks into years, and the same struggles repeat themselves with minor variations. Financial patterns remain unchanged. Relationships follow predictable cycles. Health challenges persist. There is a quiet desperation in watching life unfold as if someone else were writing the script. Yet the irony is profound. The one experiencing this repetition is the very same power creating it. Not as punishment, but as natural law. Consciousness externalizes itself. What is held within must appear without. When someone lives unconsciously, they recreate yesterday again and again, simply because yesterday's assumptions remain active today. Neville Goddard taught that imagination is the true creator, and that consciousness is the only reality. These were not metaphors or inspirational ideas meant to comfort the suffering. They were literal descriptions of how existence functions. Every external event, every circumstance, every relationship and condition is the externalization of a state of consciousness. When someone identifies with a state, they become it. When they remain in a state unconsciously, they live it automatically. The world around them simply mirrors what they are assuming to be true about themselves and reality. If someone feels powerless, the world confirms powerlessness. If someone feels unworthy, circumstances align to validate unworthiness. Not because the world is cruel, but because the world is obedient. This revelation challenges every common belief about how life works. Most people believe they are reacting to an independent external reality that determines their fate. They wait for conditions to change before they can feel differently. They hope for lucky breaks, divine intervention from outside themselves, or favorable circumstances to rescue them from limitation. But the truth is inverted. Conditions do not create states of consciousness. States of consciousness create conditions. The external is always effect, never cause. What appears solid and unchangeable is actually fluid, responsive, and completely subject to the one perceiving it. When consciousness shifts, the world must shift. There is no exception to this law. But here lies the tragedy and the opportunity. Most remain God asleep, creating by default rather than design. They inherited beliefs from family, culture, and past experience. They adopted identities that do not serve them. They accepted limitations as truth. And then, through the sheer power of assumption, they made those limitations real. The automatic patterns are not imposed from outside. They are the natural result of living from habitual states without questioning them. What would happen if someone woke up to their true nature? What would change if consciousness became conscious of itself as the creator? Everything. Absolutely everything. Because the moment awareness returns to its source, automatic becomes intentional. Reaction becomes creation. Victim becomes God awake. The concept of living on automatic is not abstract. It reveals itself in the smallest moments of daily existence. Someone wakes up and immediately checks external conditions. The weather, the news, messages from others. The first thoughts of the day are reactions, not creations. Before consciousness has even claimed its power, it has already surrendered to what appears to be. This pattern continues throughout the day. Thoughts arise from habit. Emotions respond to triggers. Actions follow familiar scripts. By nightfall, another day has passed in which divinity wore the costume of limitation. And because this happens unconsciously, it feels normal. It feels like life itself. But it is not life. It is sleep. Neville Goddard emphasized that imagination is not fantasy or daydreaming, but the very mechanism through which consciousness creates. When someone imagines something vividly and feels it real, they are not pretending. They are actually occupying a state of consciousness. And every state has corresponding circumstances that must externalize. The problem is that most people imagine automatically. They replay past hurts. They rehearse future fears. They imagine from their current limitations rather than from their desired fulfillment. This is still imagination at work, still creation happening, but it is unconscious creation. The same divine power that could produce miracles is instead producing repetition. Not because the power is weak, but because it is being directed by habit rather than intention. Bruce Lipton's work in epigenetics confirms what ancient wisdom always knew. The environment does not control biology, perception does. Cells respond to signals from consciousness, not from external reality directly. When someone perceives threat, their body adjusts accordingly. When someone perceives safety and abundance, different genetic expressions activate. This is not metaphor. This is measurable, observable science. Yet most people live as if their bodies and circumstances control their consciousness, when the truth is reversed. Consciousness is primary. Everything else is secondary. Living on automatic means allowing unconscious perceptions to run the show, letting inherited beliefs dictate what is possible, and never questioning the authority of what appears to be. How many times has someone wished for change while simultaneously assuming nothing can change? How often does hope flicker in the morning only to be extinguished by afternoon circumstances? This internal contradiction keeps divinity locked in human limitation. The desire for transformation exists, but the assumption of impossibility is stronger. And assumption always wins. Not because desire is weak, but because assumption is the actual creative force. Someone can want health while assuming sickness is their reality. They can want abundance while assuming lack is their fate. They can want love while assuming unworthiness defines them. In every case, what they assume to be true about themselves will externalize, regardless of what they consciously desire. This is why living on automatic perpetuates what already is. The assumptions running in the background remain unchallenged. Neville taught that the feeling of the wish fulfilled is the secret. Not the thinking about it, not the hoping for it, not the working toward it through external action alone. The feeling. When consciousness occupies the state of already being what it desires to be, creation is instantaneous in the inner world. The outer world must then conform, though the bridge of incidents may not be immediately apparent. But here is the trap of automatic living. Most people cannot sustain the feeling of fulfillment because they are constantly checking external conditions for validation. They feel wealthy for a moment, then look at their bank account and collapse back into lack. They feel loved for a moment, then someone's reaction triggers old wounds and they return to unworthiness. The external, which is only effect, is being used to determine the internal, which is cause. This is backwards. This is why freedom seems impossible. Not because it is, but because the mechanism is being reversed. The automatic patterns are not just mental habits. They become physical, emotional, and circumstantial realities that seem to have their own momentum. Someone tries to change their financial situation, but the same obstacles appear. They attempt to transform a relationship, but familiar conflicts resurface. They commit to better health, but old symptoms return. From the outside, it appears that external forces are blocking progress. But the truth is far more empowering and more challenging. These patterns persist because the state of consciousness that created them remains active. Changing actions without changing states produces temporary results at best. The outer rearranges briefly, then snaps back to match the inner assumption. This is not failure. This is law. Neville Goddard spoke often about states of consciousness as actual spiritual locations. They are not metaphors. When someone is in the state of poverty, they are literally dwelling in a dimension where poverty is real and confirmed. When someone is in the state of health, they occupy a reality where wellness is natural. Every possible state already exists. The work is not to create new states, but to move into the state that corresponds to the desired outcome. This movement happens through assumption. By assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled, consciousness relocates itself. And when consciousness moves, the world moves with it. But automatic living means remaining in the same state day after day, year after year, because no conscious decision to move has been made. What keeps someone locked in a state they do not want? Attention. Whatever receives attention receives energy, and whatever receives energy becomes more real in experience. Most people give their attention to what already is. They observe their current circumstances constantly. They talk about their problems. They think about their limitations. They feel their lack. All of this is attention, and attention is the food of states. The unwanted state grows stronger simply because it is being fed. Meanwhile, the desired state, which exists just as fully, remains unoccupied and therefore unexperienced. The shift required is not effort. It is redirection. Taking attention away from what is and placing it on what is desired as if it already is. This sounds simple, but for someone living on automatic, it feels nearly impossible. Why does it feel impossible? Because the senses scream their evidence. The body reports pain. The bank account shows lack. The relationship demonstrates distance. The mind says, "But this is what is real. How can I deny what I see?" But this is the trap. The senses only report the past. What is seen today is the result of yesterday's state. If someone continues to accept sensory evidence as the final truth, they lock themselves into perpetuating the past. Neville called this being a slave to facts. Facts are real, but they are not truth. Truth is what consciousness declares to be true through assumption. When assumption changes, facts eventually follow. But there is a gap, a test of faith, where the old facts still appear while the new assumption is being impressed into consciousness. Most people fail this test. They return to automatic living because the external has not yet confirmed the internal shift. This is where the understanding of consciousness as God becomes crucial. If someone believes they are a limited human being subject to external conditions, they will always bow to those conditions. But if someone recognizes that consciousness is the creator, that imagination is the divine power, that assumption is the law of manifestation, then sensory evidence loses its authority. It becomes information about the past, not a decree about the future. The question then becomes, what state is being occupied right now? Not what do circumstances show, but what is being assumed in this moment. Because this moment's assumption is creating the next moment's experience. Automatic living is the abdication of this power. Conscious living is the reclamation of it. And the reclamation begins with a single decision, to stop reacting and start creating. In the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verse 12, there is a statement so bold that most interpretations soften its meaning to make it more acceptable. The verse speaks of doing greater works than those demonstrated by the awakened Master. Not similar works. Greater works. This is not poetic exaggeration or distant prophecy. It is a direct declaration about the nature of consciousness when it recognizes itself. Every human being carries the same creative power that produced miracles, not as a gift granted by external divinity, but as their inherent nature. The works are not done by a separate God working through a vessel. They are done by consciousness itself, which is God in expression. When someone lives on automatic, this power remains dormant, creating by default rather than by design. The phrase, greater works, implies that limitations previously accepted can be transcended completely. It suggests that what seems impossible within the framework of automatic living becomes natural within awakened consciousness. Neville Goddard explained this verse through the lens of imagination and assumption. The greater works are not physical miracles performed for spectators. They are the complete transformation of individual reality through the deliberate use of imagination. When someone assumes they are healed, and sustains that assumption until it hardens into fact, they have performed a greater work. When someone assumes abundance despite contrary evidence, and lives from that assumption until circumstances conform, they have demonstrated the law. These are greater works because they require conscious participation in creation rather than passive acceptance of conditions. The verse also contains an implicit promise. This power is not reserved for a select few. It is the birthright of every consciousness. But birthright must be claimed. Most live their entire lives without ever exercising their divine inheritance because they do not know it exists, or they know intellectually but do not believe experientially. Automatic living is the result of this ignorance. Someone goes through life waiting for change to come from outside, praying to an external God for intervention, hoping circumstances will improve through luck or effort alone. Meanwhile, the very power they are seeking outside themselves is sleeping within, waiting to be awakened through recognition and use. The works remain undone not because the power is absent, but because attention is misdirected. There is profound validation in understanding this. The struggles, the repetitive patterns, the sense of being trapped, these are not punishments or signs of unworthiness. They are simply the natural result of unconscious creation. Someone who lives on automatic is still creating powerfully. They are still God in human form. But they are creating from inherited assumptions, cultural programming, and past experience rather than from deliberate choice. This realization removes shame and replaces it with responsibility. Not the heavy burden of blame, but the empowering recognition that if consciousness created unwanted circumstances unconsciously, it can create desired circumstances consciously. The same power that produced limitation can produce freedom. The direction simply needs to change. The invitation in this verse is clear. Recognize what you are and act accordingly. Stop living as if consciousness is subject to conditions. Start living as if conditions are subject to consciousness. This is not arrogance. This is alignment with truth. When someone assumes the state of their fulfilled desire and persists in that assumption regardless of sensory evidence, they are doing exactly what the verse describes. They are performing works through the same power that has always been present, now consciously directed. Automatic living ends the moment this truth is accepted and applied. Not through struggle, but through surrender to the higher identity. Not God as separate being, but God as the very consciousness reading these words, recognizing itself, and choosing to wake up. When consciousness awakens to its true nature, the entire framework of reality shifts. What once seemed solid and unchangeable reveals itself as fluid and responsive. The automatic patterns that governed life for years begin to lose their grip. Not through force or external intervention, but through the simple act of withdrawing belief from them. Neville Goddard taught that states only have power because consciousness occupies them. The moment consciousness moves into a new state and remains there, the old state loses its authority. This is not metaphysical theory. This is practical application. Someone who assumes they are wealthy, and lives from that assumption consistently, will eventually see wealth externalize. Not because they worked harder, but because they became it internally first. The responsibility that comes with this awakening is absolute. There is no longer anyone to blame, no external force to credit or condemn. Every circumstance, every relationship, every condition is the outpicturing of consciousness. This can feel overwhelming at first. Someone might look at their life and ask, "Did I really create all of this?" The answer is yes, but not consciously. Most of it was created automatically, through inherited beliefs and unconscious assumptions. The liberation comes in realizing that what was created unconsciously can be recreated consciously. The power that produced limitation is the same power that produces freedom. It never left. It was simply being directed by habit rather than intention. Awakening means taking back the director's chair. Practical examples of this transformation are everywhere once someone begins to look. A person assumes they are confident in social situations. They do not wait for confidence to arrive through repeated exposure or external validation. They simply assume the state of confidence, feel it as already true, and persist in that feeling. Soon, circumstances arrange themselves to reflect that assumption. Invitations appear. Conversations flow naturally. What once felt terrifying becomes effortless. Another person assumes perfect health. They do not focus on symptoms or diagnose themselves into illness. They occupy the state of wellness, feel their body as whole and vibrant, and refuse to accept sensory evidence as final truth. The body, which responds to consciousness, begins to align with the new assumption. These are not rare occurrences. They are natural results of conscious creation. But the automatic mind resists this shift violently. It has been trained for decades to accept external conditions as reality and to react accordingly. When someone attempts to assume a state that contradicts current circumstances, the mind floods with objections. This is not real. You are lying to yourself. Look at the evidence. Nothing has changed. These thoughts are not enemies. They are simply the voice of the old state defending its existence. Neville warned about this. He said that persistence is required not because the law is weak, but because the old state fights to maintain itself. The way through is not to argue with the mind, but to gently redirect attention back to the desired state. Again and again. until the new assumption becomes more familiar than the old one. There is a moment in every transformation where the external has not yet caught up to the internal shift. This is the critical point where most people return to automatic living. They assume the new state for a day, a week, perhaps a month. But because circumstances have not yet confirmed the change, doubt creeps in. They check the evidence. They measure progress. They allow the senses to override imagination. And in that moment, they collapse back into the old state. Not because the law failed, but because persistence was abandoned. Neville called this falling asleep to the wish fulfilled. The awakening is not a one-time event. It is a continual choosing of the desired state over the evidence of the senses. It is conscious living instead of automatic reaction. And it is available in every single moment. The existential weight of this truth cannot be understated. To realize that consciousness is the creator, that imagination is the divine power, and that every external condition is self-produced, this realization fundamentally alters the experience of being human. There is no longer a separate God to petition or blame. There is no fate imposed from outside. There is only consciousness, assuming states, and watching those states externalize as experience. This places ultimate responsibility and ultimate freedom in the same hands. The one who feels trapped is the same one who holds the key. The one who suffers limitation is the same one who can assume freedom. When this truth fully penetrates awareness, automatic living becomes impossible to maintain. Consider the metaphor of a theater. Most people believe they are audience members watching a play they did not write and cannot control. They react to the scenes as they unfold, experiencing emotion based on what appears on stage. But the truth is inverted. Consciousness is not in the audience. It is the playwright, the director, and the lead actor simultaneously. The scenes that appear are reflections of inner assumptions. The characters that show up are extensions of inner states. The plot unfolds according to what consciousness believes to be true about itself. Someone living on automatic has forgotten they wrote the script. They identify so completely with the character that they believe the play is happening to them rather than through them. Awakening is remembering the true role. The connection between body, mind, and spirit becomes undeniable in this recognition. The body is not separate from consciousness. It is consciousness made visible, tangible, experiential. Every cell responds to the assumptions held within awareness. When someone assumes vitality, cells reorganize toward health. When someone assumes limitation, the body conforms. This is not metaphor or hopeful thinking. This is the actual relationship between consciousness and form. Joe Dispenza's research into neuroplasticity and heart coherence demonstrates that focused attention and elevated emotion literally rewire neural pathways and alter physiological states. What ancient teachings presented as spiritual law, modern science is now confirming as biological reality. The body is the servant of consciousness, not its master. But how does someone who has lived on automatic for decades make the shift? How does divinity remember itself after years of amnesia? The answer is simpler than most expect, though not necessarily easy. It begins with a single decision: to stop accepting current circumstances as the final truth. Not to deny them or pretend they do not exist, but to stop giving them creative authority. Circumstances are effects. They report the past. They have no power to determine the future unless consciousness continues to assume they do. The shift happens when someone begins to assume the state of their fulfilled desire regardless of what the senses report. This is not positive thinking. This is occupying a new state of being and refusing to leave it. The call to this new state of being is not a call to effort, but to surrender. Surrender of the false identity that believed itself powerless. Surrender of the automatic patterns that were inherited and never questioned. Surrender of the need for external validation before internal assumption can be accepted as true. When consciousness surrenders its identification with limitation and assumes its true nature as creator, transformation is not just possible, it is inevitable. The external world has no choice but to conform to the internal state. This is law. This is promise. This is the truth that sets consciousness free from automatic living and restores it to deliberate creation. And the moment to choose this is always now. There is a practice that brings this understanding from intellectual concept into lived experience. It requires no special tools, no external rituals, only the willingness to direct imagination with intention. Before sleep each night, when the conscious mind begins to quiet and the body relaxes, there is a window where consciousness becomes highly impressionable. In that state, someone can choose which version of themselves they wish to impress upon awareness. Not the version that current circumstances suggest, but the version that fulfills their deepest desire. This is the moment to feel the wish fulfilled. To imagine the scene that would naturally follow if the desire were already realized. To hear the congratulations, to feel the relief, to sense the joy of completion. The key is not to visualize from a distance, as if watching a movie of someone else's life. The practice requires first-person immersion. Feeling the experience from within, as if it is happening now. If someone desires health, they imagine themselves moving with ease, feeling vitality in their body, hearing others comment on how well they look. If someone desires financial freedom, they imagine the feeling of security, the ease of making decisions without limitation, the natural confidence that comes with abundance. The scene should be simple, something that would naturally occur if the desire were already fact. And most importantly, the scene should produce feeling. Because feeling is the language of the subconscious, and the subconscious is where assumptions are stored and externalized. Repetition of this practice impresses the new assumption deeper into consciousness each night. What begins as an unfamiliar state gradually becomes the dominant state. The old automatic patterns lose their grip because attention is no longer feeding them. Instead, attention is being given to the desired state, night after night, until it becomes more real internally than current circumstances appear externally. This is not escaping reality. This is choosing which reality to participate in. Because every state is real. The state of lack is real. The state of abundance is real. The state of illness is real. The state of health is real. The question is not which is more real, but which one consciousness chooses to occupy and therefore externalize. For those who have been following these insights, there is an invitation to go deeper, to subscribe to this understanding, to allow it to become part of daily awareness rather than an interesting idea encountered once, to activate the reminder that consciousness is creator, not creation, that imagination is the divine power, not a mental game, that assumption is law, not wishful thinking. When someone commits to this path, they are not joining a community. They are remembering who they have always been. They are waking up from automatic living into conscious creation. And every moment offers another opportunity to choose which state to occupy. What would shift in your experience if tomorrow morning you woke up not as a reactor to circumstances, but as the creator of them? What would change if every challenge became an opportunity to test the law rather than evidence of limitation? The automatic patterns only persist because they are unconsciously maintained. The moment consciousness becomes aware of its role and deliberately assumes a new state, the old patterns begin to dissolve. Not through struggle, but through replacement. The new simply overwrites the old because consciousness cannot occupy two states simultaneously. There is only now, only this moment, only the current assumption. And in this moment, divinity can remember itself. God in human form can stop living on automatic and start living deliberately. The power was never absent. It was only misdirected. And direction can change in an instant, with a single decision to assume something new and persist in that assumption until the external world has no choice but to reflect it back. This is the code. This is the law. This is the truth that transforms everything when finally lived rather than merely understood.